Hey everyone, Tin Man here with another competitive deck tech. This is a video series where I go over decks that are competitive in ranked ladder and constructed play. I'll talk about the general game plan of the deck, along with each card's role in that plan. I'll also go into some of the changes that you could make based on your own personal preferences or what the meta has shifted to. This deck tech is current as of February 2018, with Dusk Road being the most recent set. So let's get to it. Today we've got Rakano Aggro. Now this is a very broad archetype that can go everywhere from a whole lot of 1-drops and really low to the ground aggro deck, and it can also go up into much bigger, focusing on war cries, focusing on more Deepforged plate, say Hammer of Might, and other kind of mid to late game cards. I think that the current best version of this deck runs somewhat of a mix of the two. It runs a lot of 1-drops. It runs 4 Oni Ronins, 3 Pyroknights, 4 steady Marshals, but it also runs 2 Deepforged plate. But other than that, the curve tops out at 3. Now this is important because you always want to have a consistent early game, a very consistent early pressure, playing a 1-drop on 1, a 2-drop on 2, and so on. That's how you get the most value out of a strong Deepforged plate on any one of your units. So let's go down the list. So as I mentioned before, our 1-drops are made up of Oni Ronin, Pyronite, and Steady Marshal. These form really the backbone of our deck. They help us to get on the board early, they help us to push damage. Oni Ronin needs no introduction. It's one of the stock standard red aggro cards. It pumps up your later plays. It's a reasonable threat on its own just because it's going to constantly tick up with the Warcry triggers. Pyronite is probably the weakest 1-drop in the deck, which is why there's only 3 of them. In the early game, it's really just a 1-cost 2/1 with Overwhelm. It gives you a way to spend your mana if you do happen to find yourself flooded, but we are only running 25 power sources, so it's unlikely that we get up to 6 with any kind of consistency. Steady Marshal is probably one of your better 1-drops as well, because it is very likely a 2/3 almost all the time on turn 2, because you have Champion of Glory, Rakano Outlaw, and other Steady Marshals, or Whirling Duo on turn 3. So it's very often a 1-cost 2/3, which is important because it dodges Lightning Storm and the new Devastating Setback, which has been changed to just -2 for this turn only, not permanent. So this dodges a lot of the AoE type removal. Other than that, it doesn't have any other text. It's just a strong-bodied unit. Now Torch and Finest Hour are some interactive cards. Obviously Torch is in every single fire deck, never leave home without it. Finest Hour is a way for your little weenies, the 1 and 2-drops, to push through the larger units. It's, say you attack with a 2/1 and they block the 3/3, well then you can get benefit out of Finest Hour by essentially turning this into a poor man's version of Torch. In most cases this is just worse than Torch, because Torch can obviously kill the guy before they block with it, so your guy can actually hit the opponent directly. But I think it definitely deserves a spot. This type of effect is an effect you definitely want often in this deck in order to be able to attack into opposing units which are larger than yours. So moving on to the 2-drop spot, we've got Champion of Glory, one of the best payoffs for playing Rakano. It's very often a 2-cost 3/3 endurance quick draw, just all around a great card for both stopping opposing aggro decks and also pushing through damage on your own. Since he's 2 color, that's very important for dodging Annihilate. So this is one of your safer units to buff up with, say, Deepforged plate or any other weapons. Similarly, Crownwatch Paladin has Aegis, so it's a very safe target to get things like Finest Hour or Warcry triggers onto. It also survives Harsh Rule and other AoE effects such as Lightning Storm, although only once, since the Aegis will then be popped. Rakano Outlaw is probably the worst 2-drop in the deck. It doesn't have anything particularly going for it. Just a 2-cost 2/2 with Warcry. The quick draw is not exceptionally relevant in the current meta. A lot of the aggro decks are not very interested in blocking, and if they're interested in blocking, they are normally blocking with things like Unseen Commando, who have 3 toughness rather than 2. So really it's just a 2-cost 2/2 with Warcry. But it is a gunslinger, which triggers Steady Marshal. But otherwise it dies to a lot of the AoE effects, so this is probably one of the weakest cards in the deck, but unfortunately it's the best we've got right now. Vanquish is very important for dealing with things like Sandstorm Titan and other mid-range sets such as Tavrod, who who didn't get nerfed in this last patch, and I'm still a little bit salty about that. I digress. Impending Doom and other mid-range threats. Since Sandstorm Titan is kind of on the decline due to the nerf of Dawnwalker, I wouldn't go up to 4 in this in the main, and honestly, you might be able to get away dropping down to 2, although Tavrod is still extremely common. So in the 3-drop spot, we're playing Sword of Icaria. Now this is a card, this slot, I've often seen people play Shogun Scepter in this deck, and in fact in previous versions of this deck, I myself was playing Shogun Scepter. But I've tried out Sword of Icaria for just a few games, and I was instantly convinced that this is one of the premier 3-cost cards that you can play in this deck. Much better than Shogun Scepter. Shogun Scepter often just gets you the first Warcry, and then your unit, since it only gets +1 on it, on its toughness, it doesn't often survive combat. It's not something like a Deepforged Plate or a Hammer of Might, which give, you know, +3 or +5. So often your Shogun Scepter unit is not going to live the turn. An extra Oni Ronin on turn 3 or 4, or whenever you're casting the Shogun Scepter, is rarely very impactful and often just gets caught up in a Harsh Rule or Lightning Storm, or just simply blocked. I mean, maybe it adds 2 extra damage many turns down the line when you attack with everybody. So instead, I think Sword of Icaria is much better. It actually allows you to commit to the board while playing around AoE effects, such as Harsh Rule and Lightning Storm. You'll notice that's a pretty common theme in a lot of these aggro decks, is how do you play around the best cards against you? And I don't think Shogun Scepter actually helps you play around the cards that are best against you, whereas Sword of Icaria does. Also, in a pinch against the other aggro or mid-range decks, it can destroy an opposing Unseen Commando, or, just act as an extra removal spell. A very inefficient torch, but sometimes you just need another removal spell. Since we can't run 8 torches, Sword of Icaria fits that mold very well. And also, unlike Shogun Scepter, this card is amazing to get Warcries onto, because as soon as you get it above that 2 threshold, it's very often that you can destroy an opposing unit and still have it if, say, Sword of Icaria is a 5/4. So I'm very convinced that Sword of Icaria absolutely has a spot in this deck. I would highly recommend it over Shogun Scepter at this time. Although, if you want to try it out for yourself, feel free. It's an easy replacement. They fit the same spot. But right now, in the current meta, with the current decks that are popular, I would recommend Sword of Icaria. The other 3 drops are pretty stock standard. Unseen Commando and Valkyrie Enforcer are simply the best Justice 3 drops. Unseen Commando buffs a lot of your units. In fact, it buffs all of your 2 drops. Champion of Glory, Crownwatch, and Rakano. And also your other 3-drop, Whirling Duo. Now, Whirling Duo is a very important card for helping the aggro matchups. It gives you a little bit of lifesteal, which can very quickly swing the board into your favor. Valkyrie Enforcer is a necessary answer spell to things such as Sandstorm Titan, because it will just silence them, Tavrod as well, or opposing flyers, just so you can have air superiority to push through the extra damage. Deepforged Plate is your kind of flood insurance. Whenever the rest of the deck tops out at 3 power, but whenever you get up to 5, this is just a big hitter. You put it on, ideally like an Unseen Commando and they don't kill it, but if you want to be a little more safe, you can put it on a unit with Aegis or a Champion of Glory so that it has quick draw with 8 power. A lot of different combinations you can have there. Overall, I think Deepforged Plate is a card that you really want in this type of deck. It helps to ensure your late game, but you don't want to load up too much on these type of effects, primarily because you have a tendency to lose your early game advantage if you have more than one of these in your opening hand. So for that reason, I wouldn't play too many more 4 or 5 cost cards, because you can just have really clunky starts. You really want to be hitting the early pressure with a 1-drop into a 2-drop into, say, a removal spell or 3-drop on 3. The power base is pretty straightforward. We've got Fire Sigils, Justice Sigils, 1 Emerald Monument. This is just a similar type card to Deepforged Plate. I could see, not playing this if you're afraid of not having untapped power on turn 1, since we do want to cast, Steady Marshal on turn 1. But the fact that this enters play depleted often can be a detriment to hitting your curve right on time. But I think the upside of a little bit of flood protection is absolutely worthwhile just playing one. I wouldn't recommend more than one. Rakano Banner, Seed of Glory, pretty standard. And Diplomatic Seal is important for hitting your early power requirements. So you really want to be able to hit, you know, a Fire or Justice 1-drop, and then maybe a Fire and Justice 2-drop, or one or the other. So your early 2 turns, you really want to have your power situation all sorted out, and Diplomatic Seal really helps for that. Once you get to turn 3, you're almost always going to want double Justice first, as opposed to double Fire if you have the option. Double Fire really only gives you Champion of Glory's trigger and Deepforged Plate, the ability to cast that, but by turn 5 you should have no problem hitting double Fire. So if you have the choice, always look to get double Justice before getting double Fire. Also, double Justice ensures that Champion of Glory is more resilient to removal spells. Things like Vara's Favor and whatnot that deal 1 damage won't be able to hit Champion of Glory as long as you have double Justice, whereas he's very vulnerable as a 3/1 with Quick Draw if you only have double Fire. So let's talk about some of the alternative cards that you can play. I said at the beginning of this video, this is a very broad archetype. You can play a lot of different things in it. So one of the options is to, say, cut Pyroknights and maybe even cut Steady Marshals, and you start adding some more weapons in the mid game. Perhaps add back in a Shogun Scepter in addition to the sword, and Hammer of Might. Possibly playing Silverwing Familiar. So that's actually another version of a deck that I have here that I've dubbed Rakano Aggro. This version runs a little bit slimmer on the 1-drop. It doesn't run Pyronite. It only has 2 Steady Marshals. But instead it's trying to go bigger. It runs some Soulfire Drakes. It runs Silverwing Familiar. And it runs Hammer of Might specifically. So these cards will help you to win a later game by making kind of a Voltron, you know, one big threat. Ideally, it's something like Silverwing Familiar, which has Lifesteal, Aegis, and Flying. You put a Hammer of Might on that, and your opponent is in a world of hurt. However, this deck suffers from consistency issues. It can sometimes just draw a hand with multiple Hammer of Mights and a Soulfire Drake, and then you don't actually do anything till turn 3 or 4. Meanwhile, you still have things like Vanquish and Valkyrie Enforcer, which aren't the best threats to empty boards. So if you don't really draw one of your Oni Ronin's Steady Marshals, or your 2-drops, then you can have a very slow kind of a slow hand that your opponent, if you're not putting the pressure on your opponent, you're losing a lot of your advantages of an aggro deck. And at that point, you're just going to start top decking, you know, your 1 and 2-drops later in the game, and you're going to fall behind a more late game focused deck. So that's all I have for this deck tech. I would highly recommend one of these types of decks for the ladder. I think I'm currently leaning towards the version that I initially showed you. Although, feel free to experiment. It's an archetype with a lot of different directions in which way you can take it. You know, exactly how aggressive, exactly how Aegis heavy, how weapon heavy, how lifesteal heavy you want to be. It definitely has a good matchup against opposing aggro decks, mainly due to the lifesteal that's inherent in the deck. And it can also fight control decks by simply being faster than them. And if you're running protects and other Aegis threats, they can be difficult. Your threats can be difficult to deal with. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please let me know any comments, feedback, anything that I can improve, any decks that you'd like me to highlight. Please send them my way. I would love to help you out. You can check out my Twitch stream at twitchtv.com/tinman354. Where I play this and other aggro decks all the time. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.